welcome again to Insight Community of the Desert and to this talk. Um, and tonight we're gonna move into a silent meditation for a while, and then I'm gonna lead us through an investigation of thinking, our own thinking, and how we relate to it, how we experience it, um, and its place in meditation. So sometimes it's a lot easier to know our bodily experiences than what's in our thinking, because so much of our thinking is automatic and as you may have noticed, seems to unfold endlessly. And so for me, sometimes it's like the noise in an airport or a shopping center, and I don't even really know is there until I'm out of it. So, so we might meditate for a lot of different reasons. Some of us just meditate to relax a little, develop a little more calm, or maybe we meditate to be a little more focused, a little more gathered in our presence, or maybe we've been told it's good for our physical health or stress. And maybe we want to do it for the reason the Buddha taught, which is to look really, really, really deeply at what is going on, what it is to have a human life, inhabit a human body, and have this experience. So when we do sit down to meditate, one of the very first things we'll notice probably is just how busy our minds are. And so the goal of meditation, and I thought I would mention this before we move into the practice, is not to stop thinking, but as I mentioned a second ago, to just really see what's going on. And so when we start our meditation practice or we're engaged in that practice, it can be really helpful to notice what our relationship is to that thinking mind. Is it something that we resist or fight or tolerate, or is it something that we can explore and learn from and coexist with? So, so that's what we'll talk about, working with thinking rather than resisting it. And why don't we move into our practice, which will be mostly silent. I'll just offer a few invitations as we begin to settle in, and then we'll move into silence for about 25 minutes or so. So I'll come back. And so we had an opportunity to just now to notice thinking in our meditation. And it's an interesting question to ask if you think that you are on generally friendly terms with your thinking, that you sort of get along with your thoughts. And probably for most of us, it's like, well, sometimes. And then if you're like me, you have moments or maybe whole days or even weeks when you just kind of want to turn that entire thinking mind off. But our minds are usually switched on and producing thoughts most of the day and a lot of the night as well. Thinking arises whether we direct it to or not. We don't seem to have a great deal of choice. And it doesn't usually stop for most of us just because we decide, oh, I'm going to sit and meditate for a few minutes. Might slow down a little bit, but it rarely stops completely. And so thinking and these secretions of the mind, as Beth Mulligan used to call them, this is thoughts, this is something that we need to make part of our practice because it's here, they're here, thoughts are here, thinking is here. So if we resist and think that they don't belong, it's going to be really frustrating when we meditate. So the question I like to ask people is if you remember when you first became aware of your thinking, sort of a meta awareness, like, oh, I know that I'm thinking. And did you become aware at some point in life of like the inner dialogue? So I remember almost, well, I remember exactly where it was. And I think I was 4 or 5. And I was sitting in the car with my mom. She was driving us somewhere. And we were stopped at a traffic light. And I remember just looking around the other people in the other cars and at my mom and kind of just wondering, are they all hearing this internal monologue that I'm hearing? Are we all doing this, or is it just me? Well, clearly it's not just me. Thinking really comes with the territory of being human. It's like one of our most human characteristics. And it's sort of like a roommate sometimes, I think, that we really had no choice in the selection of, and who is with us for not 9 months or half a year, but our entire lives. And like a roommate, sometimes our thinking can have pretty good manners, and sometimes it can be pretty sloppy seeming and careless, and we wish that it didn't live with us. So, how do we get along with it? How do we coexist? So, all these flavors of thought, creative thought, discursive thought, loving thought, obsessional thought, it's built into human experience, evaluating. So, given that we have this roommate for life who's capable of all these behaviors, how do we make friends with it? Or how do we learn to live with it? So the Buddha in one of the suttas said that our entire experience is in this fathom-long body and mind. All our experience is either sense impressions received through the body or thoughts in the mind. And it's the mind's job to think thoughts. Thinking is automatic, as anyone who's ever sat down to meditate and started noticing knows. The default state of the mind is to generate thoughts. And the mind will generate thoughts whether we direct it to or not. So sometimes when folks begin practicing meditation, we hear things like quiet the mind and body or relax your thinking. And we may get the idea that getting rid of thought is the goal. And depending on the tone of our mind, we may have some aversion to the way our mind speaks to us. And so we may really long for it to be quiet, to turn off, that we could be rid of it for a while or at least shut it off. And then sometimes, especially sometimes in meditation, thinking may be entertainment. It may actually be an area of craving, so wanting information, stimulation. And there's a subtle aspect sometimes for me where I that I kind of almost think that it's dangerous or dull in some way not to be engaged in thought. So how much do I identify with my thinking? The stories that I tell myself, the memories that I think are me. The last time I was here, we talked about that, like what we take to be me and mine, and is it? So there's a writer, Sonia Margulies, who wrote in a book, Meetings with Remarkable Women, when you are not thinking about who you are, who are you? When you aren't thinking about who you are, who are you? So getting rid of thought isn't the goal. It may happen sometimes that the mind becomes collected, gathered, and relatively still, and thinking may almost seem to completely subside into a broader sense of awareness and knowing. And this can be quite relaxing and lead to insight, to wisdom. But much of the time when we sit, we will be sitting with bodily sensation and mental activity, thinking, being present rather than not. And so in the Buddha's path, we actually really want to understand the mind. We want to see what is in our thought stream. We want to become aware of the nature of thought. How powerful is it? How permanent is it? How does it arise? How does it cease? Can it be directed? And how much am I identifying with my thinking? What's my relationship to it? So, vipassana or insight meditation is about applying mindfulness, clear comprehension to all the areas of our experience. And so we often start in meditation with breath and body. That's the first foundation of mindfulness, is body, including breath. But the Buddha also taught mindfulness of mind and mindfulness of the objects of mind or thought, quality of mind and content of mind. So those are the third and fourth establishments of mindfulness. So, what is the quality of our mental moments? How does our thinking feel? What is the tone? What is the experience of it? And what are the contents of our mental activity? What kind of thoughts are we experiencing? So, it's a little trickier than being mindful of a sensation in the body or the breath, but we can develop this mindfulness of thinking or of thought. So, how would that benefit? How would we benefit from befriending and understanding this roommate who seems to want to spend every waking hour with us? So, rather than getting caught up or entrapped, can we relax with thought? Can we chill out with this roommate? Can we learn to coexist, to hang out, but also notice when it may be trying to harass or mislead or confuse or distract us? Can we discern different types of thinking, the different modes or moods of thought, discerning the quality and content of our thinking? And can we let go of certain unhelpful types of thinking? And can we actually develop and nourish the ability to think well, in the sense of clearly, creatively, supportively? So the Eckhart Tolle, who some of you know, is quite a mystic and writer, wrote, "When you recognize that there is a voice in your head that pretends to be you and never stops speaking, you are awakening out of your unconscious identification with the stream of thinking. When you notice that voice, you realize that who you are is not the voice, the thinker, but the one who is aware of it. When you notice that voice, you realize that who you are is not the voice, the thinker, but the one who is aware of it." So, awareness of thinking without identification with the process or its contents. And we sometimes access this in practice. We create a bit of spaciousness in our practice, and we can see the thinking arising and passing away, moving in and out, knowing that thinking is happening. So it's this kind of stepping backwards and getting a wider view. And what is not thinking is just as real as what is. So research in psychology demonstrates what's called the default mind or the default mode network. And this is the sort of thinking, and you can kind of test this out, that's going on almost any time that the mind isn't actively engaged in a task. And it's this sort of automatic thinking that helps us be safe as human animals, safe in the world, safe in the pack. It's survival thinking. And I learned it as basically covering 4 areas. And the first is thinking of what needs improving, what's missing, how can I be more safe, what do I need? And the second is thinking about past and future. So, what are the dangers or rewards, the pains and the pleasures that I've experienced in the past or might experience in the future? And then there's the category of I, me, and mine, defining myself, my possessions, my things, as opposed to you and yours. And then there's social comparison. How do I fit in with the tribe, with the pack? Am I safe? Who are my friends and my enemies? So it feels true for me, and I notice that in my meditation. Okay, what is this thought? Does it fit in one of these categories? And very often it does. And sometimes, there's thinking that's just sort of meant to entertain and distract us, I think. But what's wrong with the present moment? That's a lot of what this thinking is. What is wrong with this moment right now? So our undirected, unobserved mind is most likely to spin thoughts in these areas, and they're very useful for keeping the organism, the being alive, but they're also often anxiety provoking and not always necessary or appropriate for the lives we're living right now. So the Buddha talked about two kinds of thinking that leads to suffering or thinking that leads to less suffering. And much of that default mode thinking, this primal safety thinking, leads to suffering or discomfort, to greed, aversion, delusion, anxiety. Life becomes a zero-sum game, scarcity mentality, me or us versus them. And the Buddha said simply to abandon the thinking that leads to suffering and cultivate the thinking that leads to freedom. So to do that, we have to actually be mindful of mind. We actually have to be mindful of what it is that we're thinking and have the wisdom to know, is this leading towards less suffering and freedom, or is this leading toward less suffering or more suffering? So to abandon those thoughts that lead to suffering, we have to know them. So this is why mindfulness of mind is a really worthwhile practice, because so much happens just below the surface. So, then we can start examining, and maybe in our meditation is a perfect place to do that. What does this thought feel like? Where does this line of thinking lead? What's the result of it? How do I feel in my body as I think this? And then the invitation is to cultivate thinking that leads away from suffering. So metta, or loving kindness, self-compassion, compassion for others, wishing others joy, reflecting on our own faith and confidence, remembering wisdom and compassion. And the mind states that lead toward freedom encompass the amazing capacities that we have for reflecting and pondering and creative thinking that lead to wisdom. So one way of discerning the difference between thinking that leads to less suffering and the sort of thinking that's more default mode and compulsive is to notice whether you choose to think about it and whether or not it's easy to let go of. Do I have the thought, or does the thought have me? And is there capacity for choice? And am I identifying with this thinking, or do I know it just as thinking is happening? Can I see the process? So there's a sense impression or thought that arises, and there's a response of what the Buddha called Vedana, registering of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And in a split second, mostly not even seen, there's a reaction. Oh, I don't like this, I want to push it away, or I want more of this, clinging to it. And then our conditioning, what the Buddha called sankharas, mental formations, habits of mind, start doing their thing, proliferating thoughts and concepts, desiring, projecting future trajectories, and searching the past for strategies. evaluating what if scenarios. And the proliferation fuels the clinging and makes it bigger, entangles us in the thinking. It's an automatic process without mindfulness. So we get hooked, and there's this proliferation of thinking, one thought leading to the next with very little awareness most of the time. Obsessive thinking or planning or wanting and not wanting, or maybe the mind just kind of checks out and goes from association to association, like a monkey swinging on vines and grabbing one vine and then letting go and grabbing the next. So how do we get unhooked? So this is our practice, waking up to choice, practicing this amazing capacity that we have to be aware. And one way of doing this so beautifully is by starting to work with our thinking on the cushion. So instead of like, I don't want this, I want to push it away, it's like, oh, get curious about it. What is this? What can I learn from this? And it's easier to do on the cushion because we've set that time aside. There's maybe not quite so much distraction. There's a little more of a contrast. Rob Burbea called this learning to swim at the shallow end of the pool. So our meditation is a practice period for our everyday life. So we start by grounding into our body, our breath, starting from a center that we can look at thought. When we are embodied, when we bring that embodied sense to our practice, we are firmly in the moment. We are invoking present moment awareness. And in that moment is the only place we can really be aware, that we can really see our thinking. So another very helpful practice to kind of get familiar with the thoughts that arise in your mind is the practice of labeling. And as you sit, or even as you go about the day, whenever you become aware that you've been carried away from the present moment or what you intend to be doing, just noticing, oh, okay, where am I? And simply applying a label to the thinking, remembering, judging, planning, fantasizing. And some people are really helped by this very simple act of labeling. It tends to just sort of, okay, now I am aware of what this is. Even with something as simple as a label, it creates some spaciousness and non-attachment. So suddenly I am aware of my thought, I have it, or I see it, rather than it has me and is dragging me along. And we can also label helpful or not helpful, remembering the Buddha's two categories of thought, the leading to suffering or leading to freedom. So I was thinking a lot this week of a quote from Ruth Dennison, who is a teacher of my teacher, Irina Weissman. And she said in the book, in her collected sayings called the Book of Ruth, we have two minds always running, the conditioned and the one that is intuitive and aware. We have two minds always running, the conditioned and the one that is intuitive and aware. Guess which one we want to identify with? So our practice is a process of awakening that presence. That intuitive and aware mind, and resting into that intuitive and aware mind, that larger mind, separating or creating space around the conditioned kind of thinking. And we can also notice the arising and passing of a thought, especially in our meditation practice. Can I see a thought? Can I experience a thought from beginning to end? And we can start becoming more aware and interested in the process than the content of the thought. Noticing thoughts arising and passing, like everything else that we experience, like sensation in the body, like nature, like a cloud, ephemeral, insubstantial, almost nothing really there, liable to fade and disappear, unpredictable, unwilled, not me, not mine, nothing to cling to. So, no need for attachment. So much of what happens when we get caught up by thought is what I call barking at the wind. And if you're in Palm Springs, it's a very windy afternoon right now. And our dog Skipjack used to bark at the sounds of the wind rushing around our house. He was quite sure, he was convinced that there were intruders and dangers and squirrels to be guarded against. And of course, we knew better, but it made me reflect on how many times I bark at the wind, how often I get hooked by an ephemeral thought, a view, a story, a resentment, a worry, and I cling to it, reacting to it, barking at it, not letting it go, not knowing its ephemeralness. So perhaps the most important practice is to start to identify and explore the space around the thinking more than what happens in the space. And that's the intuitive and aware mind that Ruth is talking about. So let's bring in some Thich Nhat Hanh. If you want to know your own mind, there is only one way: to observe and recognize everything about it. This must be done at all times, during your day-to-day life, no less than during the hour of meditation. So how do we do that? So he continues, when a feeling or thought arises, your intention should not be to chase it away, even if by continuing to concentrate on the breath, the feeling or thought passes naturally from the mind. The intention isn't to chase it away, hate it, worry about it, or be frightened by it. So what exactly should you be doing concerning such thoughts and feelings? Simply acknowledging their presence. That's that third foundation. Let it come, let it be, let it go. Knowing the contents of our minds with perspective, what we like to call spaciousness. Not identified with the object, but seeing it in that larger field. So another useful way to visualize this for me is imagining myself sitting in a movie theater watching a movie. And there are moments when I can get absolutely absorbed in what's happening on the screen and have physical reactions to what I'm watching as though it's really happening. It's so close. And that's what it's like when we're hooked by thinking. But then very easily my perspective can shift and realize, oh, I'm sitting in a theater. So I wake up from that sort of trance of, oh my God, this is happening. And I realize that there's a lot of space between me and the picture, and that the images that I'm reacting to are just moving shapes of light. And that what I take to be real is actually so ephemeral, and there's distance between me and what's unfolding. So in the same way, I can step back from identification with my thinking. Yes, it's there. It's truly there. But it's just energy, mental energy, and phenomena arising and passing away again and again. So there's a distinction, awareness and phenomena. There's some space. And that space gives us a ground from which to act, to investigate, to experiment. So what happens when I turn attention to knowing my thoughts with awareness, what happens when I investigate the thought from the body and the heart and not just the head. So particularly when we've had a difficult interpersonal experience and can't stop thinking about it and ruminating, why did this person do this? Why did they say this? Why did they treat me this way? Can we take a moment? Can we consciously feel it in the body as well as think about it in the mind? So we may notice more indignation in the head, in the thinking process, and maybe more tenderness in the body. And we can use that tenderness to help us reevaluate an event or to relate to it differently. So investigating not just from the head, but also from the heart and body is another way of creating a little more space around what seems so real in thinking. And then what's it like to experiment with the thinking that the Buddha said leads to freedom? Thoughts of non-harming, thoughts of letting go, thoughts of loving kindness, compassion, connection, and actually encouraging these through metta practice or through study or reading or having beautiful conversations with friends. So we may find that as we intentionally practice this type of thinking, that we are actually deepening our reservoir of well-being, our resilience, our capacity to access compassion, presence, and love. We can reprogram our thinking. And the more real it is for us, the more we invoke it, the more we have an active alternative, access to the kind of thought that's skillful and supportive and compassionate. So I wanted to close the talk with two lines, very famous lines from the Dhammapada, which is a beautiful poetic text of the Buddha's sayings. For many of us, it's the first text we read. And these are the first two lines in the Dhammapada. All experience is preceded by mind, led by mind, made by mind. Speak or act with a corrupted mind, and suffering follows as the wagon wheel follows the hoof of the ox. All experience is preceded by mind, led by mind, made by mind. Speak or act with a peaceful mind, and happiness follows like a never departing shadow. So why don't we take, if you'd like, maybe take the next 8 or 9 minutes to just explore our thinking. And to do that, I'm just going to suggest that we move into another period of silence and just practice in a slightly different way, like invite thinking to happen, invite thoughts to occur as something to notice and look at. And then I'll just drop in a few reflections as we move into the meditation. So just finding that posture, being comfortable, relaxed, and knowing that whatever arises is totally fine. And in this case, yeah, thinking, bring it on, fine, let's see what it is. And the funny thing is that often when we invite thought, it hides. It's like the one time the mind gets quiet when we want to see it. So I'm going to be quiet for a few minutes and give the mind some time to do its thing. And the first inquiry is just to notice, am I thinking more in images or in words? Is there an inner voice that's speaking? Or is there kind of a screen of or place where images appear? Or is it a combination? And what is a thought? Does it have a discrete beginning and middle and end? Or is it more amorphous? And then see if you can notice the location where thinking is happening. If you're thinking in images, is there some place where the mind's eye sees them? If the thinking is more verbal, is there a place where the speaker is? There's no right or wrong place. It's not always easy to pinpoint where thinking is happening, where it's experienced. So you might just notice, is it above or below the waist? Is it above or below the neck? Is it on one side of the body or the other, or both? And is thinking continuous, or are there gaps between thoughts? Or is it like watercolors running into each other? And finally, can you sense this intuitive and aware mind that is noticing, that is seeing, that is witnessing? So thank you for trying that exercise. For something that we do so much, it's interesting to me sometimes how little I know about it. So curious, anyone, if you would like to share your experience with that exercise, or any questions or thoughts or comments? Well, something to practice with this week. You know, it's very liberating to not turn thought into the enemy. It's very liberating to have it be okay that it's there and something that we can learn from and see. And this is how insight arises. This is how wisdom arises, by seeing the workings of the mind, and maybe seeing it again and again and again and again until we know for ourselves, okay, this is my actual experience of thinking or of this kind of thought. And then what will often happen in my own experience is that eventually I just get so tired of it. It's like I'm so tired of this story. It's worn itself out. And I've seen it play out so many times and not really go anywhere. And so then there's this kind of dispassion that happens where it's like, okay, I can finally set that down, finally let that go, stop feeding it. Okay. So, all right. Well, we will close here then. And thank you so much for coming and practicing together and trying on that second practice. And hope to see you next Saturday if you're available and able to come. And of course, Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday, next Sunday. Valerie will be with us next Sunday. Okay, let's do the dedication of merit and offer this together. And just for a moment, just feeling the practice for today, just feeling the merit, the goodness of showing up, of being in the Dharma together, supporting each other. May the strength of our presence and our practice together flower in ever increasing wisdom and heartfulness, and may it bless all beings in all realms without exception. May all beings awaken, and may all beings know peace. Okay. All right, dear friends, see you